Welcome to The Index, a podcast by the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. This series delves into the Global Organized Crime Index and takes a look at some of the biggest threats facing countries and regions around the world. I'm Tinlei Win. In August 2024, the Moroccan Justice Ministry announced that King Mohammed VI had pardoned over 4,800 cannabis farmers. This came as part of the country's wider legalization efforts to tap into the economic potential of the booming global cannabis market. Over the last 5 years, there has been a global policy shift regarding cannabis production and consumption. In December 2020, the United Nations Commission on Narcotic Drugs reclassified cannabis, recognizing its medicinal value. Morocco is one of the world's leading cannabis producers, and in 2021 approved a bill regulating cannabis cultivation for medical, pharmaceutical, and industrial purposes. According to the Global Organized Crime Index, this step towards a better regulation has contributed to Morocco's increased resilience score for national policies and laws, from 6.0 to 6.5. From 2023 to 2024, authorized cultivation has expanded from less than 300 hectares to 3,000. Morocco's first legal cannabis harvest was 294 metric tons. However, the vast majority of its territorial areas of cultivation remain in the hands of the illicit economy. With a score of 9 out of 10, Morocco currently sits at the top in the OC Index for Cannabis Trade. Out of 193 countries, only Lebanon and Paraguay have the same score. The northeastern Rif region, a long-standing hub for cannabis farming, has historically faced economic marginalization, pushing farmers towards the illicit trade due to limited alternatives. The clemency of previously criminalized farmers acknowledges cannabis farming as a legitimate livelihood and shows the will to tackle deep-seated issues of poverty and inequality. I am delighted to say that we are joined by Raouf Farah, Senior Analyst at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Raouf, welcome to the Index. Now, first of all, for those of us who are not familiar, could you give us a brief insight into Morocco's historic relationship with cannabis?
Absolutely. So, Morocco's relationship with cannabis is centuries old, deeply rooted in the northern Rif region of the country. For generations, the kif, the local form of cannabis, was cultivated for both personal and communal use, particularly in the regions that I mentioned, where the plant really adapts naturally to this environment. After the independence of the country in 1956, cannabis was basically criminalized, but the cultivation really never stopped. It actually expanded dramatically in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, turning Morocco into one of the world's largest producers of cannabis resin. This informal economy became really the backbone of the entire communities in the Rif, where state's presence had been relatively low and alternative livelihood relatively scarce. So cannabis really is not just an economic activity. It's a sort of survival strategy for tens of thousands of people, farmers, cultivators, intermediaries, traffickers, etc., whom are also trapped between a sort of illegality and necessity. So in a nutshell, that contradiction sort of between prohibition and practice defined Morocco's policy for decades, until recent reforms became basically to reshape the cannabis landscape.
Now, you mentioned just now the region of Rif. Could you perhaps maybe expand a little bit more on why this region is so important for cannabis cultivation in Morocco?
Absolutely. I mean, the Rif is the epicenter of cannabis cultivation in Morocco, both for geographic and environmental reasons. It's the region where the climate, the mountains, topography, and the soil are, between brackets, ideal for growing this traditional cannabis variety, which its name is Beldia. But beyond this environment, there is also a long story of social, political engagement of communities in the north. The Reef has long left politically and economically marginalized. Cannabis, for many, have felt the gap of sustainable livelihoods and for this absence of state investments, basically. So in the last years, the region has both faced some increasing environmental pressure, climate change, desertification, and dwindling water resources, which are most of the time provided by traffickers themselves, and the effects of the global climate change, which further limits the agricultural alternatives for communities. The latest estimation, while there's not a clear idea, not a clear number on that, but it's estimated that 300,000 to 400,000 people are directly or indirectly involved in the cannabis economy in Morocco, and most of them in the Reef region. There's also a long history of repression that bred distrust, the repression against the trafficking, but also repression against any political voices from the north, because these factors are interrelated. So maybe we will have the chance to speak about this, but the recent reform and the last royal pardon are not just about regulation. They are about repairing, or at least repairing partly, a fraught relationship between the state and a region long left fend for itself.
Yeah, so I definitely want to follow up on that, that legislative change, right? Because in the introduction, I mentioned that nearly 5,000 cannabis farmers were pardoned, and you alluded to that just now as well. What symbolic weight does that pardon carry?
Yeah, this act goes really beyond the legality itself. It's about the legitimacy of the state to engage legal activities related to cannabis in the north. The pardon acknowledges that many people criminalized under this prohibition were not just traffickers. They were simply poor farmers, cultivators, people who are trying to make livelihood out of this economy. By pardoning them, the state lowers actually the sort of threshold for entry into the legal market. It signals really a desire to include rather than to punish some of the most marginalized communities in Morocco. So even still, the facts remain really uneven. Many farmers who remained on fruit for years came back following this decision, but many of them also remained off it because they were not sure that the pardon applies basically to them. So there is also this confusion over who qualifies for what and whether this gesture truly offer a long-term clean slate for the people of Arif. So in order for this reconciliation to work, I think legal clarity and better outreach are absolutely essential.
Now, one of the things you said is that, a lot of farmers have sort of switched, but there are still many farmers who have not. So what's hindering them from switching to authorized cultivation? Are there any incentives that the government is providing to encourage the switch beyond the legal clarity that you mentioned just now?
That's a very, very important question. I mean, there are several factors that explain the slow transition to legal cultivation despite the sort of new framework implemented by the new law and the new national agency related to cannabis production. The first one, and one of the most important one, is the regulatory barriers. So basically for farmers are required to join cooperative, use certified seeds, and ensure full traceability and bureaucratic engagement. This process can be really intimidating and costly for many small-scale growers. That's number one. Number two is the absolute limited absorptive capacity of the legal market. And in 2024, a little bit over 2,000 hectares were cultivated legally by nothing more than a few thousands of farmers. This is a very, very small fraction of the total cannabis growing land in Morocco. That means that most growers are still excluded, still out of the legal system, often because they cannot be accommodated within that system. The last and not the least one probably is how illicit networks and cannabis traffickers are really entrenched within the local communities in the bay. Traffickers remain deeply embedded within the communities, providing for them access to water, seeds, providing them some cash in advance to recruit and pay people. And also because they are legitimate. They are much more legitimate than any bureaucrat who comes in these remote areas of Chefchaouen and others in the reef. So the role extends really beyond the capacity, I think, of the state to manage it from a very bureaucratic perspective.
That's really interesting. But going back to the law, right, in 2021, Law 1321 was passed, and this law regulates cannabis cultivation. What would you say have been some of the biggest developments since then?
Yeah, absolutely. So this law was at the core of the process of regulating cannabis cultivation in the country. The first big move after that was the establishment of the UNRAC, so the national agency or the national body regulating this activity. And just to repeat it, the UNRAC authorized or permitted cannabis cultivation for medical, pharmaceutical, industrial purposes, not for recreative consumption. The other big move was to provide the first licenses, which were granted last year, covering a whole range of activities from cultivation to processing to the import and export of seeds, but also to facilitating the creation of communities of workers. But despite that, I mean, these are significant institutional efforts aiming really to transform an informal and a very criminalized economy into regulated, internationally competitive one. But the legal sector, again, is still only covering a very tiny percentage of the Moroccan production of cannabis.
So, in that sense, would you say there have not been any sort of noticeable change in the illegal cannabis trade since this policy shift?
I would say yes and no. The legalization process has offered a new pathway, I would say, to those who would like to move from illicit trade to legal trade. But the majority of farmers are still operating outside of the legal framework. The other important thing to notice is that illicit networks are much better established. They offer faster payments. They require no compliance from paperwork. They provide seeds. They provide water. They know the family members of farmers and cultivators. So there's this trust relationship. They have a few steps advanced compared to the state. I think change is happening, but the change is happening at a very, very slow pace. This does not mean that these efforts should not be encouraged. Of course, they should be. However, I think cohabitation between licit and illicit will remain prevalent for a long period of time.
Now, in terms of very practical next steps, and this is the last question, what do you see are the main issues that need to be addressed so that the legalization efforts can flourish, so that the illicit economy will become bigger in the near future?
That's a very good question. I mean, I see at least 3 or even 4 issues that need urgent attention, I would say. The first one is further legal clarity and outreach from the state. I think many farmers and communities are still unsure about their legal status. I think that the question of trust is really at the heart of this process. So the state must be proactively trying to reach out communities, explain the new framework, explain how cooperatives of farmers could work, etc., etc. The second point that I think is quite important is to ensure that the pricing really represents the effort put by farmers in such an economy. Farmers need really to have the guarantees that they could make a decent livelihood, a decent revenue out of what the state proposed them as an option. Otherwise, they will just turn to the illicit networks. The third one, which I think is quite important, is the question of equity and inclusion. There's also a big fear among small-scale farmers that this whole process is only meant to allow the richest international companies and the big capital to acquire some of their production or even some parts of their land, knowing that the small farmers own really tiny portions of land each. And the last but not least is the ongoing crackdown illicit networks. I mean, many of the people who find themselves victims of this repression are also basic farmers. So the state need to find a way to distinguish between top-level illicit traffickers and those who are trying to make a small revenue out of their own production.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Index, and a special thank you to Raouf for being part of this discussion. In the podcast notes, you'll find links to some articles relating to the topic discussed in this episode. There will also be a link to the country profile of Morocco from the OC Index. Remember that the Global Organized Crime Index is a totally free resource and available to everyone. Just head over to ocindex.net. We'll be back with another episode of The Index soon. I'm Thinlai Win. Thanks for listening.